to find things.
Yep, right.
All right, so we got a couple more calls to get to, and then we're closing in on time. But I have Christian in Ohio. You're on with Matt and Dr. Darrel Ray. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Wow, I'm thankful to be here.
Oh, we're happy to have you call. What would you? It says here your position is that morality can't be consistent without a religious guide.
I'm a little nervous, so I wrote like a short little paragraph I can read. And is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
Okay, so my question is, does recognizing logic in something mean we have to act on it? For example, I recognize and can use a variety of data to prove that being a vegan is objectively better for the environment, certainly the animals, and even the individual in most cases. Now, even though I recognize this logic, is it wrong of me to not follow through and live my life according to this? And if it's not, why can't I, or anyone else for that matter, knowingly live in the falsehood of belief in a God if it allows me to live what I perceive as a better life subjectively?
Well, could you be wrong about what counts as a better life in your subjective view?
I'm kind of basing it on the idea that the subjective or that objective morality is based on the idea that we want to preserve the individualism of conscious creatures. So I don't think so.
So you're saying your subjective assessment of a better world couldn't be wrong?
I think not. Well,
we found the perfect person then, because Darrel's not perfect, but evidently you're convinced that you are, that your personal opinion about a better world couldn't possibly be wrong.
It could be wrong, but I'm basing it on science. I think it's as close to absolute as we can come.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about any specific position. I'm talking about the fact that you made this appeal to, why couldn't I live my life based on what I personally think is a better world? And I would argue that if you care about a better world, then that should be as data-driven as possible. We should be appealing to facts as much as possible. And certainly we should strive to be reasonable and consistent. But the problem is that for any individual position, we may have a bias that is preventing us from seeing what is truly the better world. And so this is one of the reasons why science doesn't operate in a vacuum. And by the way, to reference a call from Talk Heathen, science is not only not a religion, science doesn't do anything. Science is a collection of processes. It's the people that do things, and sometimes they're going to do it wrong. So when we say we have a finding of science, well, that's not a statement that this is true. Science doesn't make proclamations about truth. Science gives us the best explanations and models based on the currently available information, and it's subject to change. So yes, science is the best tool that we have, as far as I'm aware, to learn about the world, and logical reasoning based on evidence is the best way to guide our decisions. There are, though, and Sam Harris and I largely agree, but he's convinced that a la something like scientism, all of the questions of morality can be addressed. I largely agree with him, but one of the things that we may not ever be able to quantify and assess is something like empathy, which is foundational to understanding morality, in the sense where you're talking about, animal rights. Clearly, you have extended empathy to some part or the whole of the animal kingdom that puts them on a level footing with humans. Other people might not be convinced that that is a moral component. And so if that's the case, then a discussion needs to be had, hopefully supported by evidence and reason. The question you asked at the start is, if something is logical, does that mean that we should do it? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's probably just vague enough that I don't think I can give a solid answer. The intuition is to say yes, but there's another intuition there, that there are plenty of things that are logical
that are wrong.
That
are really,
love isn't logical.
Right. Yeah.
And so if I'm in a relationship with someone and I'm trying to figure, okay, here's all the things about the relationship I already know, and based on past relationships, here's what's going to happen in the future. Let me sit down and do a cost-benefit analysis of how much time I'm willing to invest in this. That may not be the best way to go about establishing a relationship. And it may be that the best way to establish it is entirely about my subjective preference. I don't care how bad this might blow up in the future. I fucking love this person, and I'm going to spend time with them. I don't necessarily see a problem with that as long as one is realistic about the potential consequences. I know that kind of diverged a bit from what we're talking about. I don't think morality is as hard as some people make it, but I don't think it's simple enough to say, oh, well, here's the logic, here's the evidence, now we're done. Because I'm not convinced that we are in a position where we can understand the entirety of a complicated subject to the point where we can simplify it to that extent. Does that kind of answer you?
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, but like to tie it back in with the veganism thing, I can demonstrate scientifically that it's the second largest contributor to climate change. So why would it not be morally in our best interest to not partake in something we don't have to? Hello?
Yeah. So
You're
you're convinced of something that somebody else might not be convinced of.
But
now,
but it was. But
no,
but if I use science to, sorry.
You're convinced of something because you have findings of science. Now, I had a long discussion with Alex O'Connor, 2 hours, and a good chunk of it was about morality, and some portion of it was about animal rights and veganism and stuff like that. And it was an off-the-cuff conversation where I hadn't bothered to look into things. Alex made some of these points talking about how going vegan may be the best thing you can do to actually fight climate change. And he cited a number of references. Obviously, we're just sitting on a couch and we didn't have time to look into it. I've since had some time to look into it. And while there is some validity to the points that he was making, there are also objections to those points, which I haven't studied up on and don't have a way to go through it. If it turns out that eating meat, the process by which we go about it, et cetera, is ultimately going to kill us all, whether it's through climate change or whatever else, then of course we should stop doing that. The problem is that I'm not yet convinced that's the case. Other people are.
Okay, but I mean, I'm not trying to...
Well, no, it seems what you're trying to do is to call in and talk about morality when you really wanted to talk about veganism.
Well, but I'm saying I see a moral contradiction in these.
And I don't.
See how you.
And I don't. And I've explained it many, many times, including that conversation with Alex. Have you watched that conversation?
I haven't,
okay,
but I'll definitely look into it.
Yeah.
But
my view of morality involves essentially a contract that is based on the notion of moral virtues and moral obligations. There are cases where if you don't take a certain action, it is necessarily immoral. And there are other cases where it's not immoral to not take the action, but it may be morally virtuous. If there's a kid standing in the street and a bus is coming and it will cost me nothing and I'm at no risk to reach out and grab that child and pull them in, I would argue that I have a moral obligation, a moral duty to do that. But if it would involve me putting myself at risk, I may not have a moral duty, but it might still be morally virtuous of me to make that attempt. It might even be morally virtuous of me to sacrifice my own life in order to save that other person. And so with those differences, I have a moral contract that is undeniably speciesist. I draw a line at independent species because just because there's a human being whose maybe brain doesn't function even on the level of a grasshopper, that doesn't mean that they're not that they are without value because they have value to other humans, et cetera. I'm willing to extend that and to extend different rights and different moral contracts to a variety of different species. I'd put dolphins and great apes and other stuff in a completely different category from grasshoppers. And anybody who doesn't, I think is nuts. But where we draw the line, and I could be wrong. I'm not saying that as a dismissal of the thing. Where we draw the line is something we're still working on. And I'm not where you are necessarily yet. And this is not my issue. So I haven't spent much time on it.
Oh, yeah, that's fair, and I understand. But I just have kind of a question. You said you would recognize that not eating meat is probably a morally more virtuous position.
No, I didn't say anything at all about not eating meat probably being a more virtuous position. I said that it may be the case that not eating meat is the more morally virtuous position.
Maybe you don't think that that's kind of obvious?
No. You could be a more morally virtuous person if you don't eat meat, but that doesn't mean that I am an immoral person for eating meat. Do you think that eating meat is immoral?
Not if you need to.
Okay.
But
what if you just want to? Is it immoral then?
I would argue if you have other options, if you're in an industrialized society, then yes, because you're knowingly choosing to do something that's causing harm to conscious beings.
So, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. Eating meat does not cause harm to conscious beings. If I find a deer on the side of the road and I eat that, I didn't cause that deer any harm. So is eating meat immoral?
Eating meat if the animal was dead due to natural causes, no. But if you are
so we're in agreement. Merely eating meat is not immoral. And so now the question becomes, when does it become immoral? And that's something that I'm not necessarily convinced of. Am I opposed to many of the harmful practices of factory farming and everything else? Yes. Am I opposed to somebody going out into their 400 acres and shooting a deer and eating it? No.
So essentially what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that it depends on the context in which you're eating meat.
Well, the eating meat part is irrelevant. It's the other actions that contribute to moral questions, not the eating of the meat.
But you don't think that it's kind of obvious that...
I don't give it... Okay, let's stop right now. Kind of obvious is not an argument. It's an assertion of opinion. I want arguments and evidence, not it's kind of obvious, because clearly it's not kind of obvious to me. But we have to move on because we're over time. Go watch the video on Alex, and you can email me, and I'll be happy to talk about it some more. But I got one more call to get to. So.